Welcome to the 37th Public Land Law Review Conference, Bridging Divides, Energy, Environment, and Empowerment in a New Era. I am Paul Kurgis, and I am the Dean of the Blewett School of Law here at the University of Montana, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today. This is one of our signature events at the law school, the Public Land Conference. We are standing here today on the traditional lands of the native peoples who lived in this part of the country, the Salish and Kootenai, of course, as well as the Blackfeet and others who made this part of Montana their home. And it's appropriate for us to be located in a place like that for a conference on public lands, because for the first peoples on this continent before the Europeans arrived, in a sense, all land was public. The first peoples didn't have a conception of private property like the one we have today. And so for us at this law school, we feel like we tap into not just a tradition here at the university, but a history that goes back way, way before, as we consider issues cutting across the intersection of public lands as well as natural resources and tribal law. Given the history of this place, it's appropriate that we host the only legal journal in America devoted to public lands issues, the Public Land and Resources Law Review, which will be publishing the papers from this conference. That law review was founded by our Professor Marjorie Hunter Brown, who had earlier established the nation's first Indian law clinic here at the University of Montana. And Professor Brown also organized the very first public lands conference back in 1978, and then 2 years later founded the Public Land Law Review with the mission of encouraging those interested in public lands issues to express innovative ideas, do research, publish their work, and bring together groups of people like this to discuss the critical issues of the day that cut across natural resources, environmental law, energy, and Indian law. Professor Brown's legacy is carried on today at the law school by our current faculty members, the advisors to the Public Land and Resources Law Review, Michelle Bryan and Monty Mills. Monty, right on time. As well as Professor Sandy Zellmer, who is a distinguished visiting professor with us this year from the University of Nebraska, and Professor Sam Panarella, who will host our first panel. Thanks to all of you for your efforts in bringing this conference together. And of course, it couldn't happen without the efforts of our fantastic students, the editors of the Public Land and Resources Law Review. And the editors are here with us. You'll see them in the back of the room. And in particular, I want to just acknowledge the editor-in-chief of the Public Lands Law Review, Jonah Brown, as well as the conference editors, Lillian Alvarez and Emily Slyke, business editor Jake Schwaller, who together put in countless hours handling the logistics, putting together the panels, getting the sponsorship, and everything else that goes into pulling off such an outstanding event like this one. Thank you. We couldn't do this without our sponsors, and I'd like to recognize them as well. You'll see them listed on the back of your program. We received generous donations from Northwestern Energy, Cloud Peak Energy, the Rocky Mountain Mineral Foundation, the State Bar Natural Resources section, as well as our own GESTRAB fund that supports our lectures and symposia on water issues. I'd also like to recognize Missoula Community Access Television, which is recording this presentation as part of a media assistance grant awarded to the law school and the PLR-LR. Each public lands conference centers on an issue that involves this set of critical legal questions dealing with public lands, natural resources, Indian law, of current interest to practicing attorneys, professionals, and students. And this year's conference cuts across those areas in its emphasis on energy, the development of energy, and the relationship between energy and environmental issues in this new era that we are experiencing with the new administration and very different sets of priorities than what we've seen in the past. That was evident if you were able to be with us yesterday for the keynote, which featured Deputy Solicitor in the Department of the Interior, Daniel Giorgiani, who talked about the initiative involving reconsideration of regulations across the government and specifically in the Department of the Interior under the Trump administration. And what really came through, I thought, in his remarks was a determined commitment. And he, to his credit, he fielded a lot of really pointed questions from our audience yesterday. And he was steadfast in repeating the priorities of the Trump administration, which are economic development and energy production, domestic energy production, he mentioned a number of times. He also emphasized, however, that this administration, like all administrations, will work within a context of legislation, court opinions, and previous regulations that will have a dramatic impact on the administration's ability to carry out its agenda. And this conference will set the stage, we hope, for a consideration of how these different groups that have these varying considerations when it comes to these issues will work together to try to create joint action to both develop energy and protect our natural resources in this new era. We pick up that discussion this morning with our first panel, which will be on water, wind, and wildlife, and then our second panel on energy, infrastructure, and culture, and then finally, our third panel, the theory and practice of sustainable energy development. And we'll have the distinct pleasure at lunch of hearing from renowned Indian law scholar Charles Wilkinson of the University of Colorado, who will discuss building bridges and the management of public lands and national monuments. We hope this 37th Public Lands Conference makes you think about how we can turn these matters into areas of joint cooperation to better manage our public lands and our energy resources. And with that, I turn it over to Editor-in-Chief of the Public Lands Law Review, Jonah Brown, and the rest of our conference.
Thank you, Dean Kyrgyz, and good morning, everyone. My name is Jonah Brown. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Public Land and Resources Law Review. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our first panel this morning. On this panel today, we will hear first from Mr. Travis Kavula from the Montana Public Service Commission. Mr. Kavula represents the Montana Public Service Commission's geographically largest district. He's also co-chairman on the Committee on Regional Electric Power Cooperation, which leads discussions on energy policy, wholesale markets, and reliability of the grid. As commissioner, Mr. Kavula has made decisions on hundreds of matters and worked on several major initiatives, including review of rates of different utilities, and has been involved in major legislation relating to energy policy reforms in the state of Montana. We'll also hear from Professor Reed Benson, who's the Dickinson Chair and Professor at the University of New Mexico School of Law. Professor Benson teaches courses relating to water law, natural resources, and administrative law, and chairs the school's natural resources and environmental law program. Professor Benson is an expert in Western water law and policy, with a focus on environmental issues and federal water project operations. And finally, we'll hear from Professor Robin Craig, who's from the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. Professor Craig teaches courses in environmental law, water law, ocean and coastal law, and toxic torts. Her research focuses on all things water, including the impact of climate change on freshwater resources and oceans, Clean Water Act, and the intersection of water and energy law. Our moderator for our first panel is our very own Professor Sam Panarella, who teaches courses here at the university in contracts, business, and renewable energy. Prior to joining the faculty here, Professor Panarella, and prior to starting a consulting firm, focused his legal practice on energy law with a specialty in renewable energy. So please join me in welcoming our first panel on water, wind, and wildlife.
This is a great turnout. We're really excited. I have the clicker. Okay, so I have the distinct pleasure of being the moderator for this panel, which means I'm going to try to set the tone. I've got 78 slides, and then we're going to get right to Travis as soon as I'm done. But I need to get my attention first. Just kidding. I only have a few. But I do, first of all, I want to thank the JustRap Fund for sponsoring this panel. We couldn't do it without them. And one more time, we couldn't do it without all those folks lined up against the back wall. They've done an incredible job, our law review, putting this panel on. And this is one of the great things about this conference is they did the work. Truly, it's student run. And I think you're going to see what a great job they did over the course of the day. Okay, so water, wind, and wildlife. A few thoughts. There's something endearingly hopeful about humans and our insistence on privileging our generation as, even though, geologically speaking, we occupy a very tiny span of time in human history, there's something about humans that wants to characterize our time as remarkable, even unprecedented, right? So we often flatter ourselves that no generation before us and probably no generation after us will see the things we saw, do the things we did, or contend with the issues we contend with. We live in interesting, never-before-seen times, we tell each other all the time. But really, most of the time, we don't, they didn't. After all, as some English guy said many generations ago, there's nothing new under the sun. So with that, I want to tell you here today that we live in interesting, never-before-seen in so many ways. And really, how can you doubt it when as soon as your head stops reeling from the last thing you heard or saw or read or tweeted or seen tweeted, the next thing comes. Before you've had a chance to absorb the first thing, the next thing, and then the next thing. We do live in fairly remarkable times. A perhaps anodyne or seemingly anodyne, but really significant part of what's going on today is this question that Dean Curtis mentioned about the role or lack of a role in the government, for the government in regulating how we use our public lands and resources, and what controls should be in place for those uses. For your consideration, the United States, we're in, no, we're out, no, actually we're back in, no, forget it, we're back out, danced with the Paris Climate Accord over the last year or so, the enormous effort to put together the EPA's Clean Power Plan, several million public comments as part of that, and then the Supreme Court's rather unprecedented stay of that plan in 2016, and then the current administration's statement recently, essentially, never mind, thanks for the work, but it's not going to happen anyway. The recent announcement, as in, I think a couple of days ago, from Secretary Perry, that he would like some incentives to reward nuclear and coal power for providing what's called baseload power. That essentially, we should be offering subsidies to those industries because of the function that they give us. And all of that, by the way, all of that happening in an economic climate that is ringing and has been ringing the death knell of coal for quite a while. And then finally, oh, that's from the wrong Kardashians, but that's actually not relevant. Okay, These are inexplicable things that made its way in. Okay. I'm going to stop talking. We have three amazing speakers. They're each going to speak for 15 minutes or so. We're hoping to reserve time at the end for you guys to have ask questions. I know you'll have a ton. Let's kick it off with Commissioner Kavula. Travis.
Thank you, Sam.
You bet.
For having me here. It's great to be back at the University of Montana. This is my second talk in this room, and it's like one of the most acoustically sound places in Montana. So I'm glad to know some of the people who are still standing in the back. It could be like, you know, it's like church where no one's sitting in the front. You can come down here and sit in the front. I promise not to project too much to the point where things are, you know, coming out of my mouth. I want to talk a little bit about the transition, in some sense, the economic regulation of public utilities, whose balance sheets are sort of the main happening point for a drive to alternative energy, how the regulation of that industry has evolved and is changing over time to incorporate more environmental considerations, and pose to you some complications that I believe that poses. But before we do that, let's sort of start at the start. And I'll just explain very briefly what it is that I do and why it is that I might be here talking to all of you today. So except for a handful of power plants, every power plant in the western United States has a commercial relationship with a regulated utility, a utility that's regulated by a public service commission like the one I'm the vice chair of. Either the utility owns it themselves or has a contract with the plant's owner to purchase its output, and those commercial guarantees are what causes power plants to be developed to begin with, or not. And so this process, by and large, is overseen by government regulators like me. And now would be an appropriate time to offer the caveat that everyone in government should, which is that these views are my own, and I'm not speaking on behalf of my colleagues or on behalf of the institution or on any pending matter. So let's just get that out of the way, because this will allow me to be at least twice as interesting as I otherwise would be. So why is it that I'm in this role? Well, basically, because in the West, with important but limited exceptions, there is no customer choice in your electric service provider. Your provider of electricity is dictated to you based on where you live by the government. And there are some exceptions, rooftop solar, large industrial customers that do have a choice. But you're still, even in those circumstances, dealing with rates that are set by government regulators, either people like me or people in the federal government. And so what does this type of regulation look like? Well, the fundamental premise is that I'm standing in essence, for you and for the company trying to mediate that relationship. It's one of the few places in the United States where we still have a very command and control central planning system, like you might see in the Soviet Union. These are utilities, granted, that are investor-owned, but they are, quote, affected by the public interest, and I represent essentially consumers rather than you representing, say, yourselves, which might be a little bit more intuitive, but we can talk about that later. So how did this all begin, and what is it that I'm supposed to be doing in this role? Well, basically, in place of consumer choice and a competitive market, where the sovereign is franchised to monopoly provider, my job is really to emulate least cost and available service, since those are the characteristics that classical economic theory tells us would result from competition. I'm also supposed to make sure that the rates that are paid are just and reasonable and not confiscatory. Not just my opinion, but the opinion of the US Supreme Court dating back many decades at this point. So in other words, this is sometimes called the regulatory compact. The idea that in exchange for a monopoly service territory, the utility is subject to rate regulation by the government. I also, in this role, stand in for customers, while other regulators do as well, by making determinations of whether capital projects are necessary. Sometimes this is called a public convenience and necessity test. And the statute I've cited there happens to be from the Federal Natural Gas Act. It controls interstate pipelines, but you would find the same language, just and reasonable for rate making, public convenience and necessity, across many state statutes and federal statutes, and the body of case law is often considered common between them. So The second one is important because if you're bringing a capital project into being in the context of a monopoly provider of service, it is all but guaranteed, again with a few exceptions we didn't get into, that you're guaranteeing a recovery of those costs from a captive set of customers. So it's devised, public convenience and necessity regulation, as a way for government to measure whether or not a project in fact is needed by this customer base that doesn't have choice. Because it has to be assumed that a monopoly with a recourse to a captive set of customers who's paid a fixed percentage return on any capital investment that it makes will want to do what exactly? It will want to invest more capital, not less capital. It will invest whatever capital it possibly can in order to capture additional rents from the monopoly consumer base that it serves, because unlike every other business on the planet, this is a business that doesn't want to do more with less. It's a business that wants to perform some basic public service function with more and more and more capital investment to make a greater return. And that's where regulation kind of comes into play to try to collar as best as we can that incentive. And that's why good regulators, frankly, are always trying to put themselves out of this command and control business by introducing competitive features into this hereto monopoly environment. And some regulators have done that quite successfully. It used to be the case that all of your telephone rates were set by the government in the same way that your electricity rates are. That's no longer the case. You now have a quasi-competitive, somewhat oligopolistic play in wireless telephony, say. But there are certain examples where regulators have managed to perceive a technological trend that is open to particular market competition. So I've placed some examples of people who are considered primarily economic regulators below: the state public utility commissions and federal agencies like FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, and the Surface Transportation Board, which is, as an institution, almost put itself out of the rate-making business entirely. So where in that context, now that we have a little bit of stage setting, where does alternative energy fit in? Well, it doesn't, at least not expressly. These types of regulators have always been focused on least cost, reliable service. It's a dual mandate, and it's somewhat, and it's not multi-dimensional, at least in its sort of first expression. Regulators of both parties have espoused fuel or technology neutrality. We say let the least cost thing win, typically. And this just isn't my opinion as a Republican. I've even cited a Democratic authority on the subject, Norman Bay, a guy who took the job of chairman of FERC only after declining to be the dean of this law school. So you miss out, he's a delightful fellow, but he shares this view that the federal energy regulator is an economic regulator. And when I asked, this was in the context of an interview with me, actually, where I asked Chairman Bay, well, what are you doing personally to save the planet from climate change, Chairman Bay? And he demurred on this, saying basically, nothing at all. That's not my job. I'm an economic regulator. Even though I'm the head of this commission that has probably the biggest power in government to bring or not bring alternative sources of energy online. Why does he answer that? Why do I answer that way? Well, because in some sense, economic and environmental regulation are opposites. Economic regulation is dedicated to increasing productivity, to try to get monopoly businesses that might have a tendency to be senescent or make economically inefficient investments or not be particularly productive, to try to increase their productivity for the benefit of consumers. Environmental regulation, meanwhile, which again serves a public good, just a different one. Environmental regulation is serving typically to constrain that productivity, basically telling businesses whose increased productivity benefits their bottom line that they're nonetheless imposing certain costs through pollution or safety hazards, and they therefore have to be, their productivity in that respect has to be constrained. So two different and even opposite things, both of which we ask the government to do for us. Now, I've given you that very simplified version of what the two types of regulation do, but relation status, it's complicated. These two things are, if not quite merging together, at least becoming more interrelated than they had been. And probably the best example of this is with alternative energy, renewable electricity in particular. Today, 29 states have renewable energy standards where they direct public utility commissions, myself included, to consider a resource outside perhaps of a paradigm of this least cost, reliable constraint. You're introducing, in other words, a mandate to select a certain type of energy source regardless of that original dual mandate that I before said. A couple of other examples might include net energy metering, and I'll talk about this one in several slides, so I won't do it now, but incorporating carbon emissions into the power sector. How does that occur, especially in the absence of any kind of cogent federal policy on carbon dioxide emissions? In addition, the determination of whether to bring new capital projects into existence through PCN, Public Convenience and Necessity Regulation, is also expanded into including more environmental considerations. There's more and more economic regulators, people like FERC, who are statutorily charged with NEPA reviews and writing environmental impact statements, so that these economic regulators have become sort of outside of their comfort zone in some way, and a PCN process that had been dedicated to the need, to the question of whether a certain project was necessary to meet customers' needs, has now been influenced by the environmental dimension. And so, as I said before, it's becoming complicated. It's becoming a little bit more multidimensional. And mainly this conversation has to do with externalities. What are externalities? They're costs or benefits that aren't incorporated within the transaction of the producer and buyer of a good. So typically when I sit and try to evaluate what rates a utility might have, I might look at something like the labor contract a utility has signed with a union, right? That at least allows me a visible price point. There are two parties in that transaction, the utility that I regulate and the labor union who is its counterparty, and in that contract there's a particular price specified for the amount of labor. And the questions a regulator like me might ask would be, well, have they signed too sweet part of a deal, realizing that they get automatic cost recovery for the most part of these costs? Are they deploying these labor contracts optimally? But at least I can ask those questions working around a transparent price in the market. Externalities don't have that. There's not necessarily a specified price for them, and energy development is full of them in economic theory. Carbon dioxide emissions. You know, in the legal regime in which we now exist, unless you live in California or a New England state, no one pops up from the ether and presents you an invoice for emitting carbon dioxide in the United States. That's not how it works. You can emit as much carbon dioxide as you want in the state of Montana, and there's no one who's going to emerge and present you a bill for the damage that you are causing to the environment. Likewise, a positive externality, the local economic development benefits of a project, say a coal mine or a coal plant. We've heard a lot about that in Montana. There are certain rebound effects or amplifying effects of energy development that are difficult to measure, and again, no one presents anyone with a bill or a credit for that kind of instrument. And I put this last one on almost to be sarcastic, except it's not. We're hearing a lot about this recently, the way the sun sets a certain way over the mountain vista behind the wind turbines. This has a real external economic value to people, say, who own land nearby where wind turbines have been sited. How does a regulator grapple with this question? As you can see just from this list of three things, it's pretty subjective. If you think energy development is causing something good or bad to happen, and that's not reconciled through the presentation of an invoice to the developer or a check being cut to the developer, congratulations, you've discovered an externality. The real question is, how do you want to reconcile that to regulation? Now, I became interested in this subject because of something Northwestern Energy did with their sponsors, so thank you before I go on to criticize the business decision that they made. So Northwestern Energy chose to buy a handful of hydroelectric dams from another utility a number of years ago, and they agreed to pay $900 million for it, a cost which is being borne by consumers right now. And they justified this price, at least in part, by attributing a value to carbon dioxide emissions. And even though hydroelectric dams obviously don't emit carbon dioxide in any great amount, they do have a value that they capture from emitting carbon-free electricity. If you theorize that carbon is going to have a value in the electricity market in the future, the value of hydroelectric production into the future is going to have a higher price, a higher value, because it doesn't have that carbon dioxide value. And so in Northwestern's $900 million transaction, you could actually trace about $247 million of that directly to this assumption of a carbon dioxide price. In other words, the larger the carbon price the utility used in its financial analysis of the transaction, the larger the price tag of the transaction could be, and the more money the utility would make from you, the customers. And so, and again, for those uninitiated in the Western marketplace, spend more, make more. That's the basic rule in utility regulation. So I was slightly annoyed at this for a number of reasons. First, I don't know why it should be up to me, a government regulator and an economic one, to try to guess what the future price of carbon dioxide should be. It seems to me that I'm uniquely unqualified, in fact, to do that. It also has the bizarre tendency, when you incorporate an externality into this cost of service economic regulation, to absolve the business that's actually buying the property of accountability for the business decision that it's making. So therein lies the irony that these dams in particular didn't do anything to incrementally decarbonize the grid. I mean, the dams already existed. They were going to produce energy well into the future regardless of who owned them. But we did put a price on carbon and incorporated that price within the transfer value of these assets. And that price was essentially captured through public utility regulation for the financial benefit of shareholders. So it's something to think about. And here you see, actually, it's a little blurry, but you can kind of see some of the work which I was critical of, where Northwestern projected a much more optimistic, higher carbon dioxide price than other utilities in the region, which allowed them to justify a higher purchase price and thus higher rates to all of you. So the bottom line is that economic regulators like me are already, in a sense, regulating for carbon dioxide. And in this case, even though I dissented on this deal, this was an all-Republican panel, essentially putting a price on carbon in Montana for the very first time. So how do we set a price on carbon dioxide in the, under the Montana Administrative Procedures Act? Well, it's not exactly precise, and I won't walk through this somewhat sarcastic slide, but this is actual testimony from one of our live hearings, where basically a witness is saying, well, I chose this carbon price because I heard a commissioner say it at a public deliberation meeting. So regulatory self-perpetuation. Someone else said, well, I read Mr. Bushnell's testimony that Mr. Hansen said it was this, so we've got hearsay. And then we have, finally, appeal to emotion. We have, well, we have to do something about the climate, don't we? So you have to choose some number. How do you set a price on carbon? There's not a very good way. So recently, this kind of carbon dioxide dragnet has widened. It not only includes the price on carbon discussion, it becomes what carbon emissions effects indirectly might a piece of energy infrastructure have. And courts have recently vacated FERC permits and the Office of Surface Mining permits for projects like natural gas pipelines and coal mines. This one happens to be in Montana, not because they themselves will emit carbon dioxide, but because they will either carry or unearth fuels which, when combusted, would. Follow that logic for a moment. And thus, their EISs should include a consideration of those indirect consequent effects of carbon dioxide. So the problem with this type of analysis is that it's even more indeterminate and ridiculous than the analysis you would have to go through in a process like mine, which I just described. And the best type of analysis, the most high-tech, sophisticated, state-of-the-art analysis that's been done on this has been with the Keystone XL pipeline, with the US Department of State. And after considering all these factors, whether the pipeline would induce more oil production or merely replace other sources, whether the oil would be produced anyways and shipped by rail from the market, it basically threw up its hands, the Department of State did, and concluded in the EIS that it couldn't make sense of any of the hard metrics, but that the Keystone XL would be, quote, perceived as enabling, end quote, emissions increases. So that was the thing they hung their hat on, not any of the actual derivative scientific analysis, but the public perception that had then been attached to the project. In other words, their EIS was the consequence of a self-fulfilling prophecy about what this particular piece of infrastructure would do. Another recent example of this type of indirect emissions analysis is from Washington State's Department of Ecology. which reviewed a coal export terminal, which would have facilitated Wyoming and Montana coal production. And their EIS concluded, I love this, that it could result in an increase of 780 million tons of CO2, or it could decrease carbon emissions by 42 million tons. How would a coal export terminal decrease carbon emissions? Well, you're shipping it to China, you're replacing less clean burning sources of fuel that they would burn, and you're inducing a price effect for coal in the United States, hastening a switch to natural gas in our own market. So how do you make sense of any of that? So how far do we take this conversation about externalities, and what do you want people like me to do about it? Do we try to incorporate view sheds? Do we incorporate economic development? How do we facilitate discussions about recreation? And how do we facilitate discussions like resilience? This is an allusion to what Professor Panarella pointed out with Secretary Perry's notice of proposed rulemaking, which he directed FERC to consider, where it's almost like he's adopted the language of the left in terms of externalities and then just reversed it, saying that there are certain positive externalities to the coal and nuclear industry that are not currently being valued in the market, therefore asking the federal economic regulator to incorporate them into your price. So you can thank Secretary Perry for listening to the legal theorists that have championed the incorporation of externalities into price, because that's exactly what he's attempting to do very foolishly, in my own opinion, in this notice of proposed rulemaking. So whose job is it anyways? Again, I go back, and I won't read this whole thing, but I would go back to what the DC Circuit said in 2000, that you have economic regulation, just and reasonable rates on one hand, and on the other hand, you have environmental regulation that should, at its best, try to derive clear, transparent pricing for environmental externalities. In other words, the invoice that can then be handed to an economic regulator to judge the reasonableness of rates and the prudence of a project. So some concluding observations. Really, the core problem of economic regulation is its rent-seeking nature. Rather than competing with other businesses and interest groups, you're competing for revenue and other favors doled out by a regulator. That when you incorporate externalities into that already complicated process, really what you are doing is introducing additional subjectivity into the regulatory process, for good or bad. Externalities need to be considered. I don't want you to go away thinking that I've said something otherwise. I'm just saying it makes it more subjective, and this increases the rent-seeking nature of the institution. And finally, I can't reverse and be pulled, so I'm going to read the last point, that it would be preferable if, again, environmental regulators themselves were able, statutorily or otherwise, to take up this burden and create a transparent mechanism or methodology to price some of these externalities so that it would be less of a bog of subjectivity. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jill. I'll turn it back to you, perhaps, and thank you for all of your attention.
Professor Benson is next. Okay. All right, very good, thanks. Good to see you all here, a wonderful crowd this morning. I'm very glad to be in Montana, my mother's native state, and glad to be at this conference. It's the 37th edition, but my first time, so I appreciate the chance to be part of the program today. And when I saw that the conference was going to have an energy and environment focus, my mind went to hydropower and fish. And you may think, wait, you're from New Mexico, hydropower fish? You got none of that. And that's true, particularly in relation to the Pacific Northwest. But before I started teaching, I spent 9 years in Oregon working on water issues for an environmental group. And there, salmon and hydropower on the Columbia were front and center all the time. And so I thought here in the Columbia Basin I should touch on that. And also, there's a recent decision in the Colorado Basin that I'm going to speak about briefly at the end of today. So Columbia, Colorado, obviously very developed rivers. And I had to begin with this quote. Parts of nature that had died and been reborn as money. So what made those rivers die as parts of nature? Federal dams. Big ones, not just one, but several up and down the river system. What caused them to be reborn as money? Hydropower generated at those federal dams. And so this brings in the conflicts between hydropower and environmental values that I'm going to focus on today. So what I'll do is a very quick bit of background on federal hydropower generally, a little bit about some of the legal issues involved in federal hydropower operations and the potential to change those operations, and finally an example involving Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado, where the feds recently redid the operating plan. So federal hydropower agencies in the West, 2 agencies built most of the big dams. The Bureau of Reclamation within Interior, which had the primary mission of water supply, mostly for irrigation, but having diversified over the last several decades. And the Corps of Engineers, which since the 30s has been building dams for flood control primarily, but for both agencies, certainly by the 40s, hydropower had become a very strong secondary mission, which at times almost seemed to eclipse the primary one. And both then would end up building hundreds of dams, including multi-purpose facilities that would cover those uses as well as recreation and things like that. There are also power marketing, and so these are the dams that the agencies that operate these dams. The hydropower generated at them is marketed by PMAs within the Energy Department, Bonneville within the Columbia Basin, and Western, or WAPA, within the rest of the, or most of the rest of the West, is the agency. So some quick facts and figures on this. The Corps of Engineers is the #1 producer of hydropower in the nation by a wide margin. It's got about, so nationally, it's got about 700 dams. Only about 75 of them have federal hydropower, combining for about almost 22 gigawatts of capacity. #2 generator of hydropower nationally is the Bureau of Reclamation. It's got several hundred dams as well, of which 57 of them have hydropower, have federal hydropower generation, with about 15 gigawatts of capacity. Worth noting that both agencies' dam portfolios average more than 50 years old. The Bureau's average is more like 70 years old for these dams. As for the PMAs, just in very brief terms, Western is bigger in area, it's got more dams, and it's got a lot more customers. But Bonneville is where the actual power is and where the revenue is. So even though it's got a smaller territory. So here's a map with Bonneville, the green area in the northwest, WAPA covering most of the western United States. And it doesn't show up well enough to really show whose dams are which. The green squares are reclamation dams, the red circles are the Corps. The Corps dominates in the Columbia, the Willamette, the Lower Snake, in the Missouri, whereas the Bureau dominates everywhere else in the West, including the Colorado River Basin. So if we look at some of the laws that govern these operations, where you've got to start is project authorizing statutes. The great majority of these projects were individually authorized by Congress, and the big boom period was the 30s, 40s, 50s into the 1960s. And they were authorized for particular purposes. And those purposes still, in broad outlines, dictate the operating priorities for these projects. And these don't change unless and until Congress changes them. Although for hydropower, there's a wide variety of actual operational practices. Some of it is run of the river that doesn't really alter the hydrograph that much. Others, peaking power where the levels fluctuate dramatically in response to changes in hydropower demand. NEPA, Got to say a little bit about NEPA in this context, particularly at a conference that's largely public lands focused. It applies remarkably little to federal dam operations, despite the fact that they are discretionary federal actions with major environmental impacts. Why? Because 25 years ago, the Ninth Circuit decided a case from Idaho, Upper Snake versus Hodel, so this was a drought case. The Bureau, in operating Palisades Reservoir, said that it wanted to drop releases from 1,000 CFS to 750, acknowledging that it would harm the blue ribbon fishery in the South Fork Snake. The Ninth Circuit said, no need to do an EIS on that because the Bureau has done this before in droughts, so it doesn't really change the status quo. And that has been extended and reinforced in a series of cases. There was another Ninth Circuit case a couple of years ago involving a Corps dam, also in Idaho, where what the Corps proposed to do was go back to a prior operating regime that they had abandoned 15 years ago because of its environmental impacts. Challenged to say, got to do an EIS on that, and the court said, no, because you are returning to a prior operating practice, you're not changing the status quo. So that illustrates how little NEPA applies in the dam operations context, and for public lands lawyers, it's eye-opening. It's eye-opening how little NEPA means in this context. In fact, NEPA in this context is a disincentive to reviewing operations because it means you've taken a federal action by doing NEPA review. So what does apply is the Endangered Species Act. Section 7 does apply to routine dam operations, and so the Bureau and the Corps have been forced to consult with Fish and Wildlife, with National Marine Fisheries on the effects of their operations on listed species, and have essentially been forced to revise operations in order to mitigate the effects on usually fish, sometimes birds, generally downstream of the project. It is the Endangered Species Act, far, far more than anything else, that has forced a look at dam operations and has brought about revisions. Nothing else has really worked. So otherwise, there is no regular review and revision of dam operating regimes. The Bureau doesn't really have operating rules and policies on this subject. Corps does. They're pretty detailed. They basically say that the operating manuals should be revised at least every 10 years. But whether it's the Bureau, whether it's the Corps, they faithfully do not review their operating plans, at least not in any kind of public fundamental way. So the contrast here is non-federal hydro, where since 1920, the Federal Power Act, non-federal hydro projects have always had licenses that expire and are subject to renewal. And so the maximum term is 50 years, usually more like 30 or 40. That relicensing can bring about significant changes in the operating regimes to the point where they make the projects uneconomical to operate. And I don't want to hold this up as a model, because everybody criticizes FERC relicensing for a variety of reasons. But at least every few decades, it is an opportunity and a requirement to review the operating conditions of a project with an eye towards mitigating some of the environmental impacts that those operations cause. And it's ironic at best that we put private hydropower projects through this, and we don't do anything similar for federal projects. So, if we think then about why do this, just very briefly, it kind of makes sense every few years to look at these operating regimes. We understand much more about the effects of various flow regimes on environmental values and other resources than we did when these projects were built. Climate change, changing the volume, the timing, the variety of precipitation has huge impacts, not just for hydro, but flood control and water supply and other functions. Responding to changes in the project area, whether it be land use changes, water demand changes, economic changes, and public values and priorities. Many parts of the West, 50 years ago when these projects were built, or 60 or 70, were very extractive, and now rely much more on environmental values and recreational amenities. So, but again, it's not normally done. One example of where it was, Lake Canyon. So this is one of the nation's, in some ways, most important dams, certainly one of the most controversial. Been true ever since it was built on the Colorado, near the Arizona-Utah line. So it was authorized in 1956, Colorado River Storage Project Act, storing water, generating hydropower, recreation. And the authorizing statute says, generate the greatest hydropower practicable, subject to water supply considerations. So, so for many years, this was operated, peaking power, enormous daily and hourly fluctuations, with big-time impacts on downstream resources, including the Grand Canyon, the nation's #2 national park in terms of visitation. So those impacts ultimately would cause Congress to pass a statute, a really rare kind of statute, saying, take a look at these dam operations with an eye toward addressing some of those downstream impacts. And so it required Interior to do an environmental impact statement and to come up with a new operating plan to protect the values, better protect the values of Grand Canyon National Park, Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. But we're keeping all the other existing laws, including the law that said generate the greatest hydropower practicable. So we want it both ways. Interior followed through, did the EIS, did the new plan, and the 1996 plan actually significantly dialed back fluctuations for hydropower. And so hydropower was, the value of it was reduced and the impacts were mitigated. So that was 1996. 13 years later, a pretty short time, the Interior Department decided to do a new one. They didn't intend to have it take 7 years, but it did. And this time the Park Service jointly led it with Reclamation. And full EIS, heavy stakeholder involvement. The states, tribes, there were 6 tribes that were cooperating agencies on this, as well as other entities. Western was one of the cooperating agencies. And it's interesting that the competing values involved here. So just to name 4, hydropower, already talked about that. Humpback chub, this is the main endangered species, the native fish, primarily down in the Grand Canyon Reach. But there's another fish involved, and it's trout in the tailwaters right below the dam, very popular recreational fishery that competes with the humpback chub. They eat humpback chub. So, so there's a real fish versus fish conflict there between those two. And finally, Grand Canyon beaches, key to the recreational rafting industry, and those beaches hammered by the construction of Glen Canyon Dam. And it's hard to change that operationally. So just very quickly, how did this turn out? The final plan made very small tweaks in hydropower operations. And the tweaks they did make benefited hydropower compared to the 1996 plan in certain ways. For purposes of those other values, we're relying on short-term, days-long operational tweaks that we hope are going to benefit. Beaches, after there's been a sediment input on one of the undammed tributaries. Trout management flows. This is about trying to strand juvenile trout so they will die. If in case there's too many trout and they're eating too many humpback chubs. Macroinvertebrate flows, trying to boost the overall food base for all the fish. And finally, low summer steady flows. There was a proposal to really keep the flows low and steady in the summertime to benefit the temperature regime for humpback chub. But the state's really opposed that, and will only do that maybe in the second 10 years. So hydropower still drives operations. I'm looking for 3 take-home messages. First, very quickly. It really shows nationally what's possible with reviewing federal dam operations. This is the kind of thing that probably should be done in more places. The results of this, very modest, but remember, they already did one of these in the 90s, and that's one more than has ever been done for most federal dams. But finally it shows that once a river has died, been reborn as money, its natural form will not be easily resurrected. Thank you.
Thank you, Reed. Professor Craig.
All right. So Reed does federal dams in New Mexico. I do oceans in Utah. There are some parallels there. I do want to thank Jonah, Lily, and Emily, and Jake, and all the members of the Law Review for having me on. I think it's the 3rd one of these I've done. And they very graciously let me come out and remind everybody that there's a whole other set of federal public lands out there that tend to get forgotten, and that's the offshore federal public lands. So a crash course in ocean jurisdiction. Under international law, which we did not sign the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, we haven't ratified it. We should, but we very conveniently view the jurisdictional provisions as customary international law and therefore binding on us as well as the rest of the world. And under those provisions, we are entitled to a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, which, because we have some pretty big coastal states and a lot of island territories, actually means we control more ocean territory, about 1.5 times the ocean territory as we control land territory. And underneath that EEZ is a parallel 200 nautical mile continental shelf that we are entitled to control, mostly for natural resource management. Now that's all well and good. That's the United States as a whole compared to the rest of the world. When you get into the federal government versus the states, you can explain 90%, I would guess, of our ocean and coastal laws by fishing and offshore oil and gas. And it's offshore oil and gas that was largely responsible for the jurisdictional division between the states and the federal government. The federal government claimed all of the offshore territory as its. Coastal states that had some pretty good oil and gas development after World War II, namely Texas, Louisiana, and California, said, no, we get some of that revenue for ourselves. That landed kind of temporally, accidentally, being California that got to go to the U.S. Supreme Court to fight that issue out. One of the many cases named California versus United States, so not very helpful in terms of name. But the U.S. Supreme Court said, yeah, the feds win. That the federal government has paramount jurisdiction over everything offshore. So it is the federal government's, to the extent the federal government wants it to be the federal government's. Congress actually 6 years later, 1953, said, yeah, we don't think that was quite right, and actually gave title back, as they put it, or gave title, as is more legally accurate, to the first 3 miles to the states. So the states actually do have a lot of control over the first 3 miles of the oceans, subject to a lot of exceptions for things like, the military and national defense and national security, things like that. But states ended up with the first 3 miles. I hit the right button. All right, so why does all that matter? Well, the ocean's becoming a more and more crowded place. So we got a lot going on offshore, different kinds of energy facilities, a lot of shipping and commerce, critters. There are critters in there if you look carefully enough. Recreation, and a few other things that we like to have going on in our coastal areas, including the extension in many coastal areas before people got serious about regulating fill of things like the San Francisco airport and New York City into what used to be open water. Now, those uses sometimes come into conflict. This is a map of what the Gulf of Maine used to look like, and you can't see the colors really well, but if you can kind of make out the large blue with the horizontal lines, that's the Navy's operational training zone in the Gulf of Maine, which, if you really look carefully, overlaps at the bottom, that red diamond-looking thing. That's the Atlantic right whale's critical habitat, which, at the time this map was drawn, also had those nice dark black lines at the bottom left going through it, which are the major shipping lanes for the East Coast. So some overlapping and actually conflicting uses. The shipping lanes have since been moved so to help not run into the right whales quite as often. But the Navy still operates there, and so there's a lot of overlapping and conflicting uses in the ocean. All right, now, where I'm heading with all of this is we've got some interesting developments going on nationally and internationally with offshore wind and marine aquaculture. Two uses that might be conflicting, might not be conflicting, but at the moment have some interesting differences in how they're regulated. So this is the offshore wind potential in the United States. We've got some pretty good areas for offshore wind. These are the actual offshore wind projects around the world. Europe has embraced this wholeheartedly. Have many offshore wind farms, particularly in the UK and Scandinavian nations. We have our first operational offshore wind farm as of last year. So Deepwater Wind did get built and is operating, but it's also a growing industry. So this is the United Kingdom's increase in offshore wind. This is Europe more generally, the steady increase in offshore wind. And this is what's been going on with permitting in the United States for offshore wind. So pretty good uptick, particularly along the East Coast. So how is this actually regulated? Well, like I said, the first 3 miles, that's still the states. And that includes, by the way, the transmission lines that get built from anything that's actually on the outer continental shelf. So the states are pretty much in charge of the first 3 miles. If you're putting in an installation in the ocean, you're almost always talking to the Army Corps of Engineers as well, under Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act. But once you get beyond 3 miles, there was a big fight over who was supposed to be in charge. FERC had a pretty good argument. This is an energy installation in the navigable waters. That sounds like the Federal Power Act. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had a pretty good argument. This is a construction activity in the offshore region. See the Rivers and Harbors Act? That you gotta come talk to us. Department of the Interior had a very good argument. This is an energy installation on federal lands. Talk to us. They actually battled it out for quite a few years before Congress finally stepped in 2005 in the Energy Policy Act, Section 388, and said, yeah, we're giving it to the Department of the Interior. I originally went to the Minerals Management Service under the Department of the Interior. First regulations came out under that regime in 2009. After the BP oil disaster, the Minerals Management Service ceased to exist for various interesting reasons. And BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, ended up with the Offshore Wind Authority when the dust had settled. So BOEM is now the primary permitter for offshore wind if you're on the outer continental shelf. And this is going to sound a lot like any other public lands with 2 exceptions. So what applies? NEPA? NEPA applies to a BOEM permit for offshore wind. What Section 7 of the ESA applies? if necessary. But then a couple other things. The Coastal Zone Management Act will apply, so states that have an approved plan, which is all the coastal states except Alaska, get to comment. And the Magnuson-Stevens Act Essential Fish Habitat provisions. So a couple other extra things, but otherwise, looks like pretty much standard permit. All right, so that's offshore wind. Aquaculture, got a huge growth in aquaculture, internationally and domestically. The reason for that, for offshore aquaculture, is because wild caught fishing is pretty much leveled off. Since about 1995, catches haven't been increasing despite increased effort. The World Bank, which is not an organization I consider particularly liberal, has said that wild-caught ocean fishing no longer responds to price signals. Doesn't matter how much you're willing to pay for another bluefin tuna, there is not another one to be caught. So aquaculture is growing to fill the demand. China's leading the field right now, and I'm running out of time, but it shows you how the growth of aquaculture is increasing. That is also true in the United States. A lot of marine aquaculture in the United States already, various ways to map that out. And this is currently the province of the EPA. Most of the aquaculture permitting for offshore is done pursuant to, of all things, the Clean Water Act. It's a form of National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit for confined aquatic animal production facilities, which is the marine equivalent of the CAFO, if you're familiar with those. But that's the primary authority. Again, you're building something offshore, you're going to be talking to the Army Corps as well, under Section 10 permits. But recently, NOAA, who you might have thought should have been in charge of this from the get-go, has stepped into the foray under the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Management Conservation Act, and in January of 2016, came up with the Gulf of Mexico Aquaculture Plan. And what's interesting about that plan is it says there will be 20, count them 20, aquaculture permits in the Gulf of Mexico, 20 facilities. They can produce a total of 64 million pounds of fish, or shellfish, per year. 10-year permits, renewable. So we've got another jurisdictional battle brewing between the EPA, the Army Corps, and NOAA over what to do with that. So a lot of potential locations. But again, both of these activities take up space. And this is something that the aquaculture facility that just got approved in Norway. Sometimes they take up a lot of space. And so we got to figure out what to do with these two space hogging growing industries. One solution is marine spatial planning. The state of Washington is going through this. I've actually just finished this up for the state of Washington. But if you can kind of make out on the end, the net result of marine spatial planning is often to separate. So you notice offshore winds up there at the top and fish are down at the bottom. They end up in different locations. But there's a lot going on technologically to combine them. So there's a lot of substrate science. Those of you who are materials engineers, turns out you can do some really cool things with the substrate below an offshore wind pylon to make it amenable to different kinds of plants, fish, clams, oysters, whatever you want. And people are pursuing that. Plus, people are really starting to look into these multi-purpose offshore living spaces known as seasteading. And if we had jurisdictional battles on a single activity, I think we should be thinking a little harder and preemptively about what we do with proposals for these. Thank you.
I'm going to ask the three panelists to come up front and stand awkwardly. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. I bet there are some out there. Who wants to go first? Over here.
Yeah, questions for Sure. So I'm a bit confused about something you said. I'd like to clarify it for me. You started by characterizing environmental regulation as being a constraint on economic activity, and then requested at the end some clarification on how to handle externalities. There's many of us consider environmental regulation as being a reallocation of the cost of economic activity. There's a way to handle the externalities rather than being a constraint on the economic activity. So is your argument then, the way I would characterize your argument, which I don't like, is a request for more and better environmental regulation so as to handle those externalities and make your job simpler?
Yes, you answered your own question, that's exactly what I'm saying.
So-
And my reference to economic activity shouldn't be taken to mean economic, objectively speaking. I mean activity of a private producer who views productivity through his own lens. From that perspective, environmental regulation functions as a constraint, whereas economic regulation functions to increase productivity.
So it is okay to say that a Republican today told me wants more environmental regulation.
Better, I think so, better too.
More and better.
I don't mean to pile on, Commissioner, but I have a question for you as well. I mean, it's sort of a question comment, I suppose. In your discussion of externalities and sort of economic regulation, I was a little confused because it seemed to me that many of the environmental externalities you were discussing are similar in many ways to we might think of as the labor externalities that are built into a monopoly, in that the producer and the employees can externalize the cost of increased labor production on consumers. And so I wasn't sure whether the concern was really about the fact that there was a market failure, which seems to be the very point of economic regulation, or about the fact that there really weren't comparables to use that made figuring out what the price point is easy. And so to use your dam example, I mean, you said at one point, what I want is an invoice. You had an invoice there, in a sense. It's just that the invoice was very hard for someone without having gone through the entire exercise of developing a social cost of carbon to figure out whether it was reasonable. Whereas, say, in the viewshed context, you really would have, I'm not sure anyone's advocating for increasing the accounting for viewsheds, but you could look at comparable real estate right prices or something like that to actually determine that. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
So, last comment first, there are people who are trying to quantify damage to view sheds for the purpose, say, of transmission siting, not, I understand, in this country, but in the United Kingdom and Ireland. Payments are made for people outside of the traditional scale of urbanism. And this really goes to the question of how far do you want to take one's concept of an externality, which can be bounded oftentimes only by the limits of one's imagination. And the two examples you raise, labor costs and carbon dioxide, are to some degree interrelated in the sense that you might have an instrument privately arrived at between two parties, some kind of a contract, that attempts to get at the cost of that externality or the benefit of that externality. But because you're in an economic regulatory setting where you're sort of seeking rights and privileges from a regulator rather than trying to trade that thing market to market, between private actors in a market, that's where the complication is introduced. So my criticism of say, internalizing a carbon dioxide price in the example that I gave is really that it represents sort of a good example of the public choice theory you heard alluded to yesterday, where a private actor has co-opted the rhetoric of the environmental movement in order to adopt a price on carbon, but who, in the end, is the price in carbon that's being paid for by all of you, even though it's not resulting in any incremental carbon benefit. Who is the price on carbon actually being dividended to? Well, the investors in a private utility who aren't actually using it to reinvest in carbon-abating forms of energy. So it's a good example of the kind of rent-seeking nature of the institution, which would be remedied if you had a more transparent and tradable price on carbon, either through allowances or a tax.
That's a very quick follow-up. Isn't that the same in the context of, say, a utility saying, well, because we're worried about living wages, we're going to increase the amount we're paying all of our employees, but doing that as a means of rent seeking? So in other words, the same sort of co-optation of aggressive values is the very issue that you were charged with addressing in the context of labor costs.
And the economic regulator would typically say, living wages aren't a problem, you know, and look to the market for comparables. And again, there is a different school of thought where economic regulators have begun in some situations to view themselves as super legislators. It's their job to do a living wage. It's their job to do carbon regulation. It's their job to determine a value of the sun setting over the mountain vista. Is that a function you want me to perform? Being granted an elected official, but in a fairly obscure office that probably no one understands? Or is that a better job, rather, for someone in a position of sovereign power at the legislature?
The question back here.
Yeah, I'll mainly direct the question towards Robin, but it's also relevant to what Reed was talking about. The issues you talked about are beautiful examples of a buzzword, the nexus of food, energy, and water systems. And of the challenges, on the one hand, at that nexus of governance and jurisdictional inability to deal with these big issues coming together, and the technical, engineering, science challenges of figuring these out. And one could place that in the same context as fish at Glen Canyon Dam and hydropower facilities. So I wonder if you could just talk a little more about sort of the balance of the sort of technical versus governance challenges in addressing some of the issues you think about.
Well, you know, the technical, the scientific part is very important for what is actually possible. So I very briefly flashed through the fishbowl aquaculture technology that's being employed off of Hawaii. That technology took some time to develop. You're basically having a floating huge cage of, in that case, native Hawaiian fish offshore. It's got some advantages over nearshore aquaculture because the fish are plant eaters. They're surviving off of the plankton in the water. They're not being fed. They're not being inoculated. You don't get the concentration of waste right below like you do with nearshore aquaculture. But that technology had to be functional before anyone was bothering to seek a permit. And then it turned out when they went to seek a permit, they didn't know quite who to talk to. And I think it's important to be aware of emerging technologies as it's going. You're not going to get the permit applications until the technology works, unless it's a demonstration project, which usually can be handled, faster ways. But if you're not aware that the technology is coming, the permit system is almost always going to lag behind, and it's important to be thinking proactively. Hey, when we have these combined facilities, we know we had jurisdictional battles over wind, we know we're about to have a jurisdictional battle over aquaculture. When we have the two combined, that's going to be a mega jurisdictional battle. Maybe we should be thinking of that ahead of time, particularly because it's starting to be employed in Europe. We know it's coming, so we know the technology works. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but yeah, the law has to be aware of what's coming technologically, because every time we're not, and this is true in many, many, many other contexts, if you think about all the privacy litigation going on with smartphones, same problem. Technology snuck up on the law, and law in reactive mode is not usually as good as law in proactive mode.
Mr. Benson?
Just on the federal reservoir context, my concern has been that the focus has been so heavily on the technical side of these operational questions and not on the sort of public or value sides. So with Bureau of Reclamation now, they've got a pilot project for reservoir operations where they are bringing some very smart people, engineers, modelers, et cetera, to the table to try to figure out how they can better incorporate climate data in their operational decisions, which is great if what you're trying to do is figure out when and how you can store more water that you otherwise might have to release for flood control purposes. But if all you are doing is the technical side of these things, then you are missing all of the a lot of other kinds of questions that are environmental and recreational and aesthetic and go to some real values choices that we have never made really since these projects were authorized, at least not in any kind of public way. So what I've advocated for is that more sort of holistic, balancing and broader consideration that I think you're talking about.
So we are out of time. I'm sure there are more questions out there. I bet these guys are going to be around today, and you can chat. Networking break brought to you by the Rocky Mountain Mineral Law Foundation, as all networking breaks today are. Thanks to our panelists. They did a wonderful job.